My name is Luana. I'm 25 years old, and what I'm going to tell you happened about a year ago on a dirt road in the interior. It was a cold night and so foggy that I could barely see a subway in front of the car. The sound of the tires crunching the damp earth and the muffled noise of the engine were the only signs that I was still moving in that white void that seemed to have no end. The road was lined with tall trees, which cast distorted shadows whenever my headlights caught them. The dense fog seemed to swallow the light, leaving everything around heavy, almost suffocating. I tried to concentrate on the journey, but there was something about the atmosphere that bothered me deeply, as if I were being watched. It was then that, on the side of the road, I saw a figure. She was motionless, partially shrouded in fog. At first, I thought it was just a tree trunk or some animal, but as I got closer, I realized it was a woman. She wore a long, light, almost transparent dress, and her face was hidden by a white veil, which seemed to blend in with the surrounding fog. There was something deeply wrong with her, but, driven by curiosity, or perhaps the need to confirm that it wasn't a hallucination, I stopped the car. I rolled down the window and asked, hesitantly, "Are you well? Need help?" She didn't respond. He remained completely still, as if he hadn't heard me. His silence was disconcerting. Before I could say anything else, I heard a voice behind me, clear and close, as if someone was sitting in the back seat. "Why did you stop?" My heart raced. I quickly looked in the rearview mirror and then turned around, but the seat was empty. The car felt colder, as if the air had been turned on in the car. I swallowed hard and I headed back to the road, but the woman was no longer there. For a moment, I was paralyzed, trying to understand what had just happened. That's when I noticed something that made my entire body freeze. The veil that previously covered the woman's face was now attached to the passenger door handle, swaying gently as if an invisible breeze was moving it. I decided I couldn't stay there for another second. I started the car with force, but the feeling that I wasn't alone didn't leave me. The sound of the engine seemed muffled, as if something, or someone, was interfering. I glanced in the rearview mirror several times, expecting to see something emerging from the fog, but all I saw were shadows moving in a slow, hypnotic way. When I finally arrived at my friend's house, still shaking, I got out of the car and looked at the passenger door. The veil was no longer there. I ran up the stairs, and as soon as I entered, I collapsed on the couch. My friend noticed my condition and told me what had happened. I reported everything, from the woman to the voice in the car. As I spoke, her face became increasingly pale. When I finished, she was silent for a few seconds before saying, in a hesitant whisper, "Luana, this road, they've been saying for years that no one crosses it alone without taking something with them." The silence that followed was almost unbearable. And since that night, I've asked myself, what exactly did I bring with me? My name is Daniel. I'm 28 years old. This experience took place in an old mansion where I worked as a caretaker for a few months. The mansion was located far from the city, on top of a hill surrounded by dense woods, and its history carried a weight that few were willing to mention. It all started one autumn night, when the wind blew strangely, as if something was whispering among the trees. My job was simple: make sure everything was in order before the new tenants moved in. The mansion had many wings, but one of them always seemed out of place, the east wing, where time seemed to stand still. That night I needed to do one last inspection. As I opened the door to the east hallway, the smell of aged wood and musty books flooded my senses. I only carried a flashlight and a notebook for notes. But it was when I reached the end of the corridor that something peculiar caught my attention: an open window in the last room. The strange detail was that that window had been locked for decades, or so the records said. As soon as I got closer, I felt an inexplicable shiver. The air felt colder there, as if the space didn't belong in the same world as the rest of the house. When I shined the flashlight into the room, I saw that it was empty except for a rocking chair and a black-framed mirror facing the wall. Just as I touched the window to close it, I heard a soft sound, like the creaking of a step, being dragged along the floor. I turned around immediately, but nothing seemed out of place. The mirror remained motionless, and the chair was still. But when I focused my flashlight on the ground, I noticed footprints that weren't mine, imprinted in the dust. My breathing became heavy. I decided to write down what happened, but when I opened the notebook, I noticed that there was something written on one of the pages. The lyrics weren't mine. The phrase just said, "The window should never be closed." I swallowed hard, but refused to give in to fear. I closed the window tightly and locked it. That was when the mirror, still facing the wall, made a slight clicking sound, as if someone had broken it. I didn't have the courage to check. I just left the room and locked the door behind me. The next morning, I told my supervisor what happened. He just looked at me seriously and said, "Don't ever go back in that room again. Some things don't like to be disturbed." I never found out what really happened that night, but one thing is certain, something in that mansion watched more than it should have. My name is Helena. I'm 37 years old. A few months ago, I decided to rent a small country house to rest. I was exhausted. The idea of a distant place, surrounded by nature, seemed like the perfect solution. The ad said the house was cozy, with a stunning view of the hills. But what she didn't mention was the oppressive silence that hung over her. On the first afternoon, while walking through the rooms, I noticed something strange. The silence wasn't the comforting kind you expect in a refuge. It was so silent it made your ears ring. No sound of birds, no rustling of leaves. Just a void that seemed to absorb everything around it. When night arrived, the atmosphere became even denser. I turned on all the lights, avoiding discomfort. While I was making tea in the kitchen, I heard something. The sound was discreet at first, almost imperceptible, cutlery being moved, as if someone was thinking in the drawer behind me. My heart sank, but I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps the sound of some furniture would settle on the old floor. I gathered my courage and turned to investigate. The drawers were closed, but when my eyes looked up, I noticed that all the kitchen cabinets were wide open. Each door opened like a silent mouth. My stomach turned. I closed each one, trying to convince myself that maybe they hadn't been closed properly. It was then that I noticed something in the kitchen window. On the glass, a short sentence had been written, as if someone had drawn it in steam. "Do you see me now?" The message was clear, but I hadn't boiled water or done anything that would cause steam. My hand shook when it touched the glass, which was cold as ice. Before I could react, the oppressive silence was broken. A deep, low sound echoed through the house, as if the walls were breathing. It wasn't a natural sound. It was organic, irregular, as if something invisible was living there, within the structure of the house. I ran to my room, trying to decide what to do. I grabbed my keys and my cell phone, but my fingers were shaking so much that it took me a few seconds to open the front door. I ran out and got in the car. I locked the doors and started the engine, but even there, with no apparent comfort in the vehicle, I felt like I was being seen. I spent the rest of the night in the car, parked in the driveway, staring at the house. The lights I had left on began to flicker at irregular intervals. Every time one of them went out, I felt a chill running up my spine. The next morning, I left that place and never came back. When I told the story to the owner, he just laughed, as if I were another one on the sensitive guests list. But the phrase on the glass and the deep sound continue to haunt me. And to this day, when everything is too quiet, I can almost hear that breathing again. My name is Claudio. I'm 41 years old, and a few months ago I moved to an old house in the countryside. I bought the property for a surprisingly low price, which should have been a wake-up call, but at the time I thought it was just an opportunity. The house was filled with antique furniture, each carrying the weight of stories I never knew and, honestly, never wanted to know. The basement, in particular, caused me inexplicable discomfort. It was a damp space, with a musty smell so strong that it seemed to permeate the walls. The only light bulb in the place, old and weak, blinked constantly, as if it would go out for good at any time. For weeks, I avoided going down to the basement. But one day, while organizing some boxes in the living room, I found a small wooden chest with rusty hinges. He was hiding under a pile of old blankets. Upon opening the trunk, I came across an antique pocket watch attached to a silver chain. Its surface was worn, but it was beautifully detailed, with hand-engraved arabesques. When I pressed the button to open it, I noticed something peculiar. The hands turned in reverse, quickly, as if they were racing against time. I found that curious, but soon thought it was just a mechanical defect, the result of years of neglect. I decided to put it back in the trunk, but just as I closed the lid, I heard something that made my heart skip a beat, footsteps coming from the basement. The sound was clear and rhythmic, as if someone was walking calmly below. I swallowed hard and for a moment considered ignoring it. Maybe it was just the old plumbing in the house or an animal. But curiosity, or perhaps stubbornness, I ended up overcoming fear. I grabbed my cell phone to use as a flashlight and headed down the creaky basement stairs. When I got down there, I noticed that the lamp was completely off. The space was filled with a heavy, almost palpable darkness. My flashlight barely seemed to have any effect, but even in the dim light I could see something that made my blood run cold. The pocket watch, the one I had left in the box upstairs, was now on the floor, completely open. The shadows around me seemed alive, moving on the walls as if dancing to the rhythm of an invisible wind. The air was colder, and my every breath came out like a cloud. I hesitated before approaching the clock. When I finally bent down to pick it up, it started making a sound. It wasn't the ordinary ticking of a clock, but something much deeper, much more visceral. It was a rhythmic and low beat, like the sound of a beating heart. My body became paralyzed. The sound seemed to echo inside me, synchronizing with my own heart. And as I tried to understand what was happening, I heard the footsteps again, only this time, they weren't in the basement. They were going up the stairs. I dropped the watch and ran upstairs, locking the basement door behind me. Since that day, I have avoided going down there again. But sometimes, in the silence of the night, I can still hear the rhythmic beats and slow footsteps echoing through the house. And every time I think about the clock, I can't help but ask myself, what exactly was it ticking? My name is Felipe. I'm 34 years old. I'm a literature professor, and my story occurred one night when I was working late in an old library in the most isolated wing of a university. It was the kind of place where time seemed to stand still. The walls were lined with tall shelves, filled with books so old that their covers crumbled to the touch. I was finishing proofreading a manuscript when I noticed a strange sound, the rustling of pages being turned, but I was the only one there. I looked around, trying to locate the source of the sound. I went to the darkest corridor, where the rare books were kept. There was no one there, but on the floor I found an open volume, with the pages shaking gently, as if someone had just read it. As I approached, I smelled a peculiar smell of burning paper. I picked up the book, but it felt cold, like ice. As I leafed through it, the words began to disappear from the pages, leaving only blurry marks, as if someone was erasing the text before my eyes. Then I heard it, a soft message, low but filled with anger. "Get out of here." My heart raced. I looked around, but the library was empty. Suddenly, all the lights flickered, and the shelves seemed closer, as if the shadows were swallowing the space. I ran towards the door, but it was locked. The voice now turns into a chorus of indistinguishable voices. When I finally managed to get out, I looked back and saw something impossible, a tall, slender shadow disappearing between the shelves.